Many swords and edged weapons from history can strike with both edges, the true edge and the false edge. But I don't want you to be seduced by the myths of the false edge cut. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now over the years we have discussed the use of the false edge. In fact, I've demonstrated it in various cutting videos and other things. And one of the beauties of double-edged swords, or indeed swords which have a false edge, a raised yeoman like on this toolbar here, is that you can perform cuts with the back edge. Now, before I go into the details of the nature of those cuts, I want to make one headline clear. False edge cuts, while they can be tricksy, cunning, and even often offer you angles that you can't get with a true edge cut some of the time, and we'll look at those in a second, they are, generally speaking, way less powerful and way less potent, and therefore way less fight ending than true edge cuts. So just to make sure I'm absolutely clear with you on that, true edge cuts, that is cuts with the front edge of a sword, are pretty much always more potent, more powerful, more predominant in fighting with swords than cuts with the back edge. Not to say that cuts with the back edge don't have their place, but we should never give equal weighting to a back edge cut as to a front edge cut. Moreover, because the back edge cuts are almost always weaker, and yes, they can get to some angles and some places that the true edge cuts just can't reach, but while they are weaker, they therefore aren't so important, or sometimes not important at all, to certain parts of the body. And that's a very important thing to point out, that false edge cuts, while they could be given to any part of an opponent's targeting, so whether we're doing it in sporting competition or whether we're looking at real historical combat, false edge cuts generally are only regarded as potent, or shall we say life-changing, fight-changing, if they are aimed at the opponent's hand, sometimes the lower arm, and the head and neck. Okay? Generally speaking, we do not see false edge cuts given hardly ever, and I'll give one exception, but hardly ever to other parts of the body. They are called the manchette in French Victorian era sources. In fact, if you look at Sir Richard Francis Burton of the 1870s, he has a whole section on the use of the manchette or false edge cuts, and they are pretty much all targeted at the opponent's hand, which of course doesn't have fabric covering, or in some cases the forearm. However, I would say that in most cases, most of these false edge cuts wouldn't even cut through a sleeve like on this fencing jacket here. Really, they need to be aimed at the hand and wrist. And in fact, manchette gives us the word sleeve. So they are literally aimed at the sleeve. They're not aimed at the torso. They're not aimed at the thigh or the buttocks, the ribs, whatever, because they simply wouldn't do enough to change the fight at those targets. I said I'd mention an exception. The exception is the hamstrings. That is the hamstrings behind the knees. And in fact, if we look at Hutton's The Swordsman, the version of the second edition of 1897, How to Fight an Uncivilized Enemy, which I've done videos on in the past, he does in fact use the false edge in close-in grappling distance for draw cuts. Okay, now that's an important distinction to make. A draw cut to the hamstring, or indeed to the back of the neck, as shown in Hutton, is quite a different thing to an actual swinging cut. Okay, so we could divide these into rakes or slashes and chops. Okay, and with chops, front edge cuts are way more potent, and in sporting terms should be scored much more highly than any kind of cut with the false edge, in my opinion. So generally speaking, I'm going to break down these false edge cuts that were used historically with a variety of weapon types, such as this side sword here, into three types. Okay, those that come from below, those that come from above, and there's those that are specifically targeted at the opponent's weapon arm. I'll put this side sword down for a second and just point out that this could equally be applied to things like this longsword. Now, I should mention at that point, I'm going to be predominantly looking at one-handed swords here. But when you have a two-handed sword, yes, indeed, false edge cuts become more potent. So I know that there'll be lots of longsworders out there, particularly probably from Lichtenau lineage, but could be from Rozzo, could be from Fiore and Vardi, who will be saying, but false edge cuts, there's loads of them in the longsword sources we look at. And yes, there are a fair number. However, they are generally aimed at specific targets. Okay, they're usually aimed at the arms or the head because those are particularly vulnerable and relatively easy to wound targets. So, for example, if a full edge cut comes down either to the side of the head or the top of the head, that will split the scalp open and cause lots of blood. It might not finish the fight. It's very unlikely to cut through bone because it is a relatively weak cut. And generally speaking, of these rising cuts that come up from the middle iron door or alba under the arms, these are also relatively weak cuts. I mean relatively compared to conventional downwards chops, fendenti in Italian. However, people who've been hit around the side of the head by a particularly powerful zwerchal might dispute, although in that case that's actually true edge, but if they come around with the false edge here, they might dispute the fact that these are weak blows because they can rattle you, they can be pretty damn strong. And yes, indeed, people can cut through tatami, double tatami mats with these false edge cuts. It is possible with enough of a swing up, enough of a wind up. However, what's usually possible with a two-handed sword is not necessarily possible with a one-handed sword, because with the two-handed sword we have this torque or leverage between these two hands, which you don't generally have with a one-handed sword. So yes, indeed, while we do see false edge cuts given with one-handed swords, such as this side sword or a langmesser, for example, generally speaking, these cuts, while they might be enough to affect the fight, they might be enough to wound the person if aimed at the head or aimed at the arms, they don't have enough cutting power usually to be aimed at the body or even, I would argue, the upper legs most of the time. So in other words, when we come to a weapon like the sabre, which is held forwards and in one hand, these little cuts underneath the hand might have enough to slightly wound the opponent and have some effect on the target. So if we're looking at Burton's manchette, for example, indeed, you might be able to get a small wounding blow. But a small wounding blow here with the false edge is never going to be as strong as a downwards cut with the front edge for a whole bunch of reasons. The musculature of your body, gravity, all sorts of things are set up in a way to mean that a cut downwards with the same circular motion as the upwards cut has more force. And some people might point out to me, but Matt, therefore, why are some swords like this talwar here or a Turkish pala or kilich, why do they have such raised yeomen? And indeed, this was to try and increase the effect of the false edge cut to some extent, and increase mass at the tip of the blade. So yes, indeed, if you are cutting up with the false edge either downwards or upwards or downwards, then more mass at the end and a raised shape can increase the potential of the cutting with that false edge. So I said that I was going to talk about, and just very briefly to mention, obviously there are lots of swords like this wakizashi which do not have an edge on the back, and while you could hit someone with the back edge, it's not really going to do very much because there's no edge there. So this really only applies to double-edged swords and to swords which have a specifically sharpened false edge or yeoman, okay? And that means that does apply to quite a lot of European and Asian swords, in fairness, and African as well. So, generally speaking, you have rising false edge cuts, which can offend usually underneath a person's arm, but sometimes on the inside of the legs. You have falling or descending false edge cuts, which usually involve a twisting motion. So sometimes it might be that you've launched the initial attack with the front edge, which is being parried, and after that you come round the person's blade and drop down onto the other side with the false edge, for example. You could twist it from the outset as well in order to get a higher angle and come over the person's guard. You can do wrapping or circular sideways cuts which come around with the false edge and come around someone's guard, even around someone's arm or head or body, to hit them kind of in the back, and this is used a lot in SCA combat. Now, you can do these effectively. The edge alignment is more difficult, but you can do it, and people have demonstrated it on tatami mats. And the final one to mention for offending a person's sword arm is if you've crossed their blade, and this is more applicable to curved swords, if you've crossed their blade by inverting the sword this way, you can actually drop your false edge across the back of their sword arm and then do what Waite would call a retrograde cut, a draw cut over the back. But equally, this could also be a push or draw, or it could even be a chop if you've got enough angular momentum to it. So these sorts of false edge cuts can be hugely useful because they can come from angles you don't expect, they can come around someone's guard, they can come over the top of a parry, all of these sorts of things, and they can be more difficult to defend against. But I want to come back to my original point, and that is false edge cuts, while they are useful and you should do them, in my opinion, should not necessarily be scored or regarded as equal to front edge, true edge cuts. Because the reality, and you can demonstrate this on any kind of cutting target like thick tatami mats or indeed meat and bone, the reality is that these false edge cuts, even most of the time with two-handed swords, although two-handed swords are more potent because of the two hands on them, but especially with one-handed swords, these one-handed cuts, unless you make such a wide motion, but generally speaking with a motion from the wrist downwards with a front edge, will be far more powerful than a motion from the wrist upwards. Your arm is simply not designed to pull back in this way as strongly as it's designed to drive forward. So, my solution to this problem in fencing terms is that false edge cuts, fine, do them, allow them, respond to them, learn to defend from them, but when we're targeting parts of the opponent's body, be mindful of a person wearing clothes, wearing normal fighting gear. Would this cut have any effect on that target? And most of the time, a false edge cut will only be useful against certain parts of the opponent, particularly their hands and their head. In some cases, their forearm, and in some cases, things like the hamstrings and the sides of the knee and stuff like this. But really specific targets. A lot of the body, it will have minimal effect with a false edge cut, and there's also issues of edge alignment as well, which I won't go into here, but they are more tricky to perform reliably as well, false edge cuts. And I myself have actually injured myself. I strained my wrist cutting targets with false edge cuts. You can absolutely do it, but it's less powerful, it's harder to get right, and you're more likely to injure yourself. Anyway, there we go. So a lot of people, I think, talk about double-edged swords as this wonderful thing that the longsword has over the katana is it has two edges and you can cut with both edges. Yeah, that's great, but that doesn't mean that both edges are equal. The front edge is always more powerful than the back edge, even if sometimes the back edge gives you an angle that the front edge can't. I hope that's been useful and thought-provoking. Maybe you massively disagree. This is a complex topic and I've quite tried to squeeze it into as concise a Matt Easton video as I possibly can do. But if you've got comments or thoughts, get posting down below. I hope to see you back on the channel really soon. I have been Matt Easton. I will, of course, continue to be. Cheers, folks.